Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to today's Truth Factor discussion, time when we come together every week via the internet and Google Hangouts to study the Word of God, to factor the truth into our daily lives. We are absent Paul Adams this morning, where he preaches in Ellisville, Indiana. They have a gospel meeting this week, and so he has responsibilities that call him away today. And Daniel, hopefully, will be joining us here in a little bit. So we have sitting in for Paul, Seth McDonald. Let's start with you, sir. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing very, very well. It's good to be with you guys. I'm thoroughly happy to be here and studying this chapter with us. Hopefully, we can get some good ways into it.
You and me both. Tom, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Everything is going well out here. Looking forward to another week of study as we continue our study in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're actually within a context of we're going to begin in verse number 3 today, dealing with the role of man, woman in relationship to God.
All right, that's right. That's exactly right, and that's where we will begin this morning. What I'd like to do is, we had left off last week with having talked some about verse 3. I'd like to take a minute and bring verse 3 into the mix one more time. Verse 3 tends to be a very crucial verse in looking at this context because it establishes a principle that is at the basis, if you would, for everything that the Apostle Paul is about to say. So, Seth, you said you're going to screen share that for us?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's bring that up there, and we're reading this morning from the English Standard Version, I believe. Is that right, Seth?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's go ahead and begin reading in let's just start in verse 2, just for the sake of the context, and let's read through verse, again, we get the same thing we got into last week, finding a good breaking point. Let's stop. I'm going to stop there in verse 7. So follow along as we read 2 through 7 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now I commend you because you remember in me everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short, but since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. All right, the English Standard Translation takes a bit of liberty there in use of the term wife instead of woman. And I think we talked some about that. The problem, the issue I see with that is by using the term wife instead of woman, he's talking about the relationship in a marriage between the husband and the wife. If you use the term woman, then it steps back to a more global, if that makes sense, the proper use of the term, I guess, global application of it, putting men and women in the proper place, if you would, as in relationship to God. So there in verse 3, notice he makes the point. He says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. I'm actually going to shift now.
I switched to the New American Standard.
Okay. All right. That sounds good then.
Yes, sir.
Switching to the New American Standard Version, I'll read from that. Notice in verse 3 he says that, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and Christ is the head, or God is the head of Christ. All right. Something we already talked about last week, but establishes the fundamental principle. All right. Any other comments from you guys before we continue with a verse-by-verse discussion with this?
Well, it's very clear. You know, it's one thing. The reason that this passage is controversial isn't about what Paul is teaching at all. Everyone agrees that really what Paul is teaching is that people should stay in their place where God put them. God gives us all roles. Gave Christ a role, gives men roles, gives women roles. None are better than others. Men aren't better than women. They just have a different job. We all have different roles. And the point that Paul's making here is, women, you be women. Men, you be men. Don't confuse those roles between each other. There is an authority hierarchy, and you need to follow that. That God has put you where you're supposed to be, and stay there. And for the most part, I've very rarely heard anyone say anything contrary to that point. That's what Paul is trying to teach here. Where the controversy happens is, how do we apply it?
All right, yeah, I think that's a good one. How does it alter our lives? Does it manifest in any way? Yeah.
Right.
All right, Tom, any thoughts?
No, I think he said it well.
All right, I like that. I like the way you said that. Bear with me just a moment. I neglected to update one quick important page here. Some people still use the old viewing page, and I neglected to update that for the purpose of our study. So it's going to happen here in just a second. So, a fundamental principle. Now, what Paul's getting ready to get into here in just a moment is really going to beg a couple questions, and we're going to try to talk about them as we go through here. And I don't want to belabor this much longer, but when you were talking about the roles, Seth, in relation to Christ being the head of man, man being the head of the woman, God being the head of Christ in various roles, when you stop and you look at what Christ did, we see this attitude of his being manifested in his submission unto his Father. When you talk about the role of men, well, man in general is in submission to Christ, but really there's nothing in the role of man that outwardly says, I am in submission to Christ, other than complete submission and obedience. The woman does have her hands tied, for the lack of a better way of putting it, and it probably truly is much better ways, in that if she's married, she's been subjection to her husband. If she's a member of a local congregation, there are certain things she cannot do. Do you think that would be fundamentally the application of what you're saying, or the limitations that would be brought about by this order?
I was trying to read Randall's comments over in the chat. But there are limitations. There are authorities you have to answer to. We understand that we're supposed to respect the authority of Christ, respect the authority of God, and God has given man certain authorities to, and what great responsibilities they are to look out for the betterment of their spouses, of women in general, and women should respect that authority as well. It's certainly part of this point.
All right. Let's go ahead and take Randall's comment from the chat room real quick, and then we'll, as he'll say here in his comment, we'll get into the verse by verse discussion of this. Bear with me a minute. Bring this up, and Tom, go ahead and read that for us, starting with "not only does."
Okay. Randall says, not only does verse 3 set the stage for the rest of the chapter by understanding the chain of command, if you follow, or if you will, for the church, but also we need to understand this chapter first in the time period and context of when it was written. Also, what those Christians had access to that we do or do not have access to. I think many brethren look at this chapter in retrospect instead of in the context of understanding the setting and the time in which Paul is writing. That's why we need to take it verse by verse and see what applies and what does not apply. Of course, the order of headship still applies, but the application of other things in this chapter may or may not apply today.
All right, that's a very good point. Very good
yes.
point.
And I'm in agreement with that. Now, I will say this. Obviously, we have brethren who do not take it that way. You know, I mean, and one of the reasons we have some brethren who believe that when women are in the assembly, they need to have some sort of a covering on their head, is because they don't see it as specifically traditional or dealing with the customs that were associated with Corinth. I personally agree with Randall. I believe a lot of it does have to do with the customs of that day.
All right. Well, all right.
And we'll get to that.
Ahead in the general discussion. Yeah, that's right. So let's start now with verse 4 there. And notice, and I'm right now I'm going to be reading from the New King James. He makes the point that every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. It's interesting to see Paul's development of this. After having made the statement in regards to as Randall put it, the chain of command, or God, Christ, man, and the woman there, he then begins this section there with verse 4 by saying that every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. All right, let's first look at the action here that he's talking about. He specifically addresses praying and prophesying. Now, if we're going to talk about what he's discussing here, we need to keep the context of 1 Corinthians in place. Do y'all think what we read in verse 4 in chapter 14, it would be directly connected with what Paul is talking about here when he says praying or prophesying?
I very much believe it has bearing, because when you get over into chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, you know, Paul places some restrictions upon women in the worship service that they are to keep silent.
Well, and even verse 12 talks about the various gifts.
Yeah, exactly. And based upon that text, speaking of the assembly, it is my conclusion that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is dealing with an occasion other than the assembly. And if that applies to the women, it would apply to the men in that circumstance either. And one observation that I would make in that is, I see in this expression here, I think the point that Paul is making is that man needs to stand up and be a man. He needs to stand up and take responsibility for his role just as much as a woman needs to take responsibility for her role. Understanding his place in the line of submission. He is under submission to both God and Christ Jesus, as was just mentioned a minute ago. And I make that point because you know, we sometimes talk about women usurping authority over men in our society and not wanting to accept their role. Well, we also have men that don't want to accept their role. They don't want to be the head of the house. And in public, getting away from the worship service, they don't want to stand up and be the man that God wants them to be in society. And so I think it's a concern both directions.
If you look really closely at verse 4, there's something about dishonoring his head. That there's a play on words there. You know, if he prays with his literal head uncovered, he just said that head of every man is Christ. If he prays or prophesies without anything on his skull, he's dishonoring Christ somehow. And then if a woman prays with her head uncovered, she's dishonoring her head, being the man. It seems like he has a play on words here. Now, how is it that a man with his head covered dishonors Christ, and how is it that if a woman prays with her head uncovered would dishonor her husband? How is it that happens? You know, culturally, we don't really understand, but it obviously has something to do with designating roles between men and women. If a man has his head covered, it's like he is acting like a woman, and if a woman has her head uncovered, she's taking responsibility, usurping the authority over her head, and claiming to be someone that she's not. That she's taking a step too far by doing that. And it's the same thing as if she had her head completely shaved. Both would be a shameful thing to have your head shaved and to get out of your place.
All right. Speaking of head covered or not, we really can't tell whether or not your head is covered or not, Seth. You still got the Bible verses up there.
Yes. Well, I did that on purpose because I'd rather look at Bible verses than myself.
Okay. Let me approach this from a little bit different direction. Still looking at these verses. Throughout the teachings of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, and clearly here, I would say the praying and prophesying has to do with I know there's disagreement on whether this is in worship or out of worship, but in the connection with the two together with 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Corinthians 12, strongly suggests an exercising of a miraculous gift. But is there anywhere in the Old Testament that would set any sort of type, anti-type, any type of precedent illustrating that it was wrong for man to approach God with his head covered and wrong for a woman to approach God with her head uncovered? Now, I'm not trying to say just because it's not there doesn't mean that this is ruling it out, but there's got to be some connection. The people in Corinth would have to understand what Paul's talking about. What is the connection here? Where is, what Paul, why are you talking about this? And for us, with us today, it's very hard to relate to this because in our culture today, women don't have their heads covered at all unless they wear a hat. And some men may go with long hair, some men may not. And so, to me, that's really the greater question here, and I'm not sure if that question makes sense. Does it? What do you think?
Daniel, you want to chime in?
Yeah.
Right on that.
I guess the point is, okay, praying or prophesying is going to be, and here we're trying to keep it to the context, so praying or prophesying is going to be the exercising of miraculous gifts. All right, but very clearly one is teaching through prayer and talking to God, of course, and the second one is communicating the Word of God to the people. Not quite the same prophecy as we understand from the Old Testament as far as predicting of future events, but conveying of the message of God to the people. Where's the precedent that would suggest that if a man prayed to God with his head covered, that it would be a shame? How were the brethren in Corinth to understand what Paul is saying?
And that's really the question. If anyone who wishes to say you really need to wear a covering, you really should answer the question. Do you believe that this is something that God has always expected from all people at all times? Or is this something that Paul, as a apostle of Christ, through a special revelation from Jesus, says now in the time of Christians, this is the way that it should be done? If you say that you have to wear a head covering, you have to answer that question. If it's something that God has always expected, then how do you account for Nazarites who had long hair and Eve not having a covering? She didn't have anything on. How would you account for that? So if it is a brand new commandment that Paul is giving to all Christians everywhere, as he even says in this letter, he's teaching everything the same way in every single church. I'm not sure that it necessarily applies to this particular passage, but that there's some new commandment given by God. So you'd almost have to say that this is only a New Testament principle if it's something that should be universally accepted. It has to be something brand new in the New Testament. Now, if we didn't have 1 Corinthians 11, what would we know about it? We wouldn't know anything at all. So, and Paul leaves us, it seems like, with more questions than answers as far as how to apply this. It seems like it's something that that the Corinthian brethren obviously knew about, whether Paul talked to them about it on his first visit or something that happened later on. That the Corinthian brethren know what Paul's talking about, and we don't. They've got a special insight that we have lost somehow over time. It seems like that there is no anything in the Old Testament that really sets this precedent.
Well, like I mentioned, we had received an email or more of a comment earlier after last week's study, and the brother there made the point that the point is God, Christ, man, woman, and the symbol of the authority of a woman was the covering or the veil. And I come back to the very question you're talking about. Why? Where's the biblical precedence? Or is it a brand new command that he's been given? Some commentaries suggest that he's addressing a well-understood custom of the time period and here's what brother Mike Willis in his commentary, if I remember correctly, suggests that you had Greek women obeying the gospel and refusing, seeing no need to go with the veil, or wanting to shave their head. He took the position, I think it was, that they were wanting to shave their heads like others around them in the world, and that was creating the controversy. Speculation, clearly,
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think some people miss the point when they try to make this passage about women, when it's obviously equally giving weight to
Correct.
men, if not even more weight to men, because they're the ones who are addressed first concerning this thing. And one of the things that we see is in Roman cultures, men did veil themselves, in worshiping deities and things of that nature. And you compare this to, maybe Moses' veil that he wore, for instance, and so that definitely has a precedent in other cultures,
Right.
and other examples of men veiling themselves.
Real quick, Daniel, I'll ask you this: when he talks about having his head covered, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't looked at this today, the Greek word there for that covered, is that not his head completely covered, draped?
Yeah. When you look at, I think it's, let me see, I read this recently, katakalipto, and so with that word, what it's talking about is a covering or a veil. That's how most people will go with it. Even Bloster, Bruner, and Funk, which is the best intermediate grammar, it's going to give equal weight to it saying a covering or covering it itself. And so really this is the only time that it's talked about covering yourself in the middle tense there. Mm-hmm. And so with this, you kind of get to the debate where even those in the Jewish culture understand this is not just something on top of your head. In fact, they have, is it the yarmulke that is just on the crown of their head? Is right. That what it's called? Yes. So the culture there shows you that they don't see that as a veil in that custom. Nobody's ever had a problem with a man wearing that, but what is being expressed as a veil, and you compare that to Moses, where he talks about being unveiled, which is kind of an antonym of this word. And nobody pictures Moses veiling the glory of God from his face, if you will, with just something on top of his head. Nobody does that. But that's the antonym that Paul uses in describing the veil is that 2 Corinthians 3 or okay. I may be wrong.
All right, I appreciate it. That's kind of what I remembered from my studies, that it wasn't some simple something on top, that it's the actual veiling of his head. Now, we've got some comments in the chat room. It is an interesting thing to point out, though, that praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. Would y'all say the second use of the term head is talking about Christ, or is it dishonoring himself?
It seems like it's talking about Christ, in my opinion.
That would be the suggestion based on the way it reads, yeah.
Well, if you're dishonoring yourself, you're dishonoring Christ.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Sure, and I have no problem with that. I would say it talks about dishonoring himself, which will in effect dishonor Christ. So I think both of the principles are included in there.
Okay. But there has to be something understood by the brethren that praying in this fashion brings dishonor upon oneself and upon Christ. You know, to me, this is what makes the passage so difficult. They had to understand what Paul was talking about. You know, and he's telling the men, keep your head uncovered. Women, keep your head covered when doing these things. Tom, you were saying, and then we'll jump to the chat room.
No, actually, Daniel said the same thing I was saying. I think it's both. If you dishonor yourself,
yeah,
because you're not doing,
verse, right?
you know, you're not showing submission to God as a man.
Okay, all right.
In the process of doing that, you're dishonoring Christ, and so yes.
All right.
And something, you know, I know this is backing up a little bit, and I was a little late, so I don't know what you guys talked about. But, you know, it's interesting to me in my studies this week when I was looking at verse 2, how he compliments them for maintaining the traditions that he delivered, yet it seems like he's having to teach them about head covering. So what they were maintaining as far as traditions was not the head covering itself. That's
right.
Not what he's complimenting them on. It seems like the head covering is in effect of a different maybe tradition that he's talking about. Maybe something like the distinguishment of sexes, for instance. Maybe that was the tradition, and the veil is part of the instructions that he's given to them to help along with that. But that's just something that I observed.
All right.
To me, it would be a far more egregious sin to dishonor Christ than it would be to dishonor myself. It seems like Paul is saying, hey, when you're doing this, you're dishonoring the person who is your head. It seems like that is the more weightier way that Paul could put it, and it seems that way to me. Right. But certainly, you know, you're dishonoring yourself when you dishonor Christ.
That's right. Well, let's jump to the chat room now. There's a good bit of comments, and I've not looked ahead, so I'm not sure exactly what's waiting for us there in the chat room. But I like the way Randall starts his comment, because I was going to say the same thing and realize he said it very well. So let's bring that in. And Daniel, go ahead and let's start bringing in some of the chat room feed there with verse 4.
Okay. Actually, can you have somebody else read that, brother? Because I think I have a virus on my computer, and there keeps pop-up messages that are coming on.
Uh-oh. So. You need to try run Malwarebytes.
I have. It hasn't caught it. I need to
okay. All right.
figure out something.
So Daniel's got a virus, maybe. All right, go ahead, Tom.
Okay. Randall says verses 4 and 5 are tied together. The question we have to ask is, are they doing the same action? And the answer is absolutely yes. What the men are doing, the women are doing. Same action, not two different actions, as the proponents of the covering would argue that she is doing a different action. And I think a few moments ago that was kind of the point that I was making by alluding to chapter 14, where it talks about women in the assembly being silent, you know, as far as the leadership position. I believe the praying and prophesying here would be the same, whether it's the man or the woman. It's in that environment.
And whatever the covering was for the man not to wear is what the woman was to wear.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Exactly. So we'll keep going. He goes on, as Seth pointed out, she has to be doing something vocal to be looked at as being a man, not listening to a prayer or prophesying, because no one would know she is usurping authority. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I want to let me comment on that for just a moment, just real quick. You know, whenever we're in the assembly and a man is leading a prayer, we're all supposed to be praying. You know, whether we're following along so we can say amen, or we're using that time to pray to God. I mean, it's, you know, sermon is where you listen. Singing and praying is something you don't listen to, but you're involved in.
Right.
Whatever that's worth. Yeah. All right, let's go to Josh Thornhill's
Okay,
comment. Tom, you
yeah.
might know the fella.
Yeah. My son says, I know of some who believe the head covering to be the hair, but it could not be so because the man prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. He would need to be shaved or he'd be covered.
All right,
And we'll deal with that more when we get to that verse.
Yeah.
But that is a point.
Yeah.
Randall goes back and says, this is at any time they were exercising spiritual gifts. Then Paul is going to put a restriction on the women later on in chapter 14, which then makes it a moot point in the worship service.
Okay. Let's
So
continue.
we're there. And then Antoine Tidwell, or Antoine Eugene Tidwell, asked the question, was praying ever a spiritual gift? And
right.
Randall actually mentions 1 Corinthians 14 and verse number 14.
All right, let's read that real quick. I'm going to bring it in. Paul writes, for if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. That's the passage he's referencing.
Yeah.
All right, Tom, continue.
Okay. Chance Rufino, who's also out here on the left coast, California, Galatians 3 verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And as far as our discussion, that's obviously a point for us to keep in mind. We all belong to Him, and we all have to submit.
Right. Okay.
Randall goes on. Nobody will answer my question. I hope we did.
We did. Yeah.
Is what the men are doing the same as what the women are doing? If you answer my question, you solve the entire debate because we no longer have spiritual gifts. If you keep avoiding it, you continue to swat at every hypothetical out there. And Josh just in the chat, yes, they are doing the same, and we've already. There's no doubt that there is no partiality with God, and no one is better than another. But males and females have different roles, and that is absolutely true.
That wasn't a reference to Galatians 3.
Yes, that was a reference to the Galatians. And then, of course, the banter, Randall.
Okay.
Thank you, Seth. It seems that way. Josh.
Okay. You know, and that is a very interesting point that has been brought up by Eugene there in the chat room asking about the prayer. If it wasn't for chapter 14, we might be left scratching our head a little bit more. But when you look at the phrase praying or prophesying, the only conclusion I think you could successfully draw is that the praying is the same praying found in 1 Corinthians 14:14 in regards to praying being some sort of miraculous gift. Unless you somehow or another separate it, and prophesying isn't a miraculous gift, but just a reference for teaching, then you would have if a man prays or teaches with his head covered. And I'm not sure if the context then would even support that.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, well, he's clearly been dealing with spiritual gifts ever, you know, or he's going to be dealing more with spiritual gifts when we get over into the next chapter.
Yeah, but going back earlier, some of the divisions that developed among the congregation had to do with the various that they had.
Yeah,
and the differences,
the jealousies
among brethren there.
Fighting over it.
Yeah. All right, so here contextually, what we have in verses 4 and 5, same thing. If a man prays or prophesies with his head covered, he dishonors his head. If the woman prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, she dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. Now, does the Bible anywhere, anytime, make the point that it is wrong for a woman to have a shaved head outside of this particular chapter? This is what we were talking about earlier. Okay?
Yeah, you know, I think there were some times in the Old Testament, wasn't there, when she had done something, I don't remember where, but when she had done something that was dishonorable.
Well, even in touching her dead body.
What's that? Yeah.
When someone, male or female, if they touched a dead body, did they not have to be shaved?
Yeah, leprosy was the same way. You know, if I understand, leprosy. But as far as a worship service, no. Now I will say this. One thing to keep in mind when you look under the old law is God demanded respect when man worshipped him. And whatever instructions he gave them, he expected them to follow those instructions and show a proper attitude. I mean, priests in their service, they had to be clothed a certain way. And all those types of things. So it was important to God, and bringing that back to this text, I think the emphasis here is, when you go back to the point, understanding your role where God is concerned, we have to demonstrate that respect to Him in our worship, in our service, whatever we do.
Might I add something real quick? It is obvious in our modern culture that the roles of men and women are completely out. That they're not, that people in general do not respect what the Bible has to say on in such matters. Just people have problems with pride in general. I have a good friend. Every time he preaches, to keep himself humble, he takes his shoes off and he preaches in sock feet. That's something that he does. He doesn't require it of anyone else, and he doesn't demand that anyone else, when they get up to preach, take their shoes off. But it's something that he does for himself to keep himself humble, and it's something that I respect. Now, people women who want to help themselves to remember their role and help themselves to stay humble, tie a string around your finger, take your shoes off, put a doily on your head, whatever it takes. If you want to do something to help you show your subservience, and it's something that you want to do, then by all means, I don't think anyone here would say no, you shouldn't do that. That you're sinning when you do such things. But that it can be a very personal thing, and I don't know that anyone here would say that it would be a wrong thing to do.
Okay, all right. And any thoughts about that, guys? I think Seth, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
So one thing before we move on to the next verse, I just want to kind of re-emphasize, however you take what Paul is saying, sorry, in verse 5 there, it was a shame for a woman to have her head shaved. I mean, that would be that clear, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, based on the way Paul words it.
Common sense tells us that.
Yeah. And then verse 6, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. Now, I wonder, and maybe I'm just reading too much into this, and tell me if I'm wrong here. It is interesting that at least in the New King James, they use the phrase, but if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. Is that if pointing to a cultural understanding, or is it just more of rhetorical, assuming what is already understood by truth?
It seems like the many questions that he's asking, as far as if that have no answer, are somewhat what we would call rhetorical statements, assuming the answer within that, if it is the same, if it is the same as her head is shaven or something like that, seems to be, maybe we would say since, it is the same, because it is a shame, or even in verse 13, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife or a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? It seems like he's answering their question in the affirmative. Yes, it would be a shame. That's how we read that, and so that would be maybe the point that is answered there. But
it is an interesting thought, Daniel, because you brought up before. Hang on just a minute. Can't type and talk at the same time, apparently. and remember my point. It is interesting, though, I think, that if you were to take the English Standards Version position and change the women to Y, that it would even be more so, because I was looking at the comments that the English Standard Version Study Bible has, and kind of paraphrasing it, that they kind of appear to take the position that if you were a married woman, you walked around at that time, you walked around with your head covered. If you were an unmarried woman, you would walk around with your head uncovered, showing that you were available then for marriage. Or possibly a shaved head might have been a sign of a prostitute, and so if a woman shaved her head, then she would look like that. Again, I don't really see that in the text, but it's a thought on it.
And even some problems with that. I think it seems like it's more focused on the women, and I think that's something that, you know, there's a couple indications that show it's not just about women. First, he addresses men first, and I think we can all agree that whatever the man is doing, the woman is doing. They're doing the same actions, you know, and I think we can agree on that at least, right?
Yeah, we're talking about a man praying or prophesying, or a woman praying or prophesying.
Yeah, and then you get to another point. I think we agree on that. You know, whatever the woman is to wear here, the man is not to wear, and so that would be the same. Ago.
Yeah. Whatever the woman is to be covered with, the man is not to be covered with.
Exactly, and so when we get to the points of, for instance, just history, there's also points in history that not only that show that women showing their hair off was a sign of sexual availability, if you will. The same is with men. If they had long hair or maybe loose hanging hair, that was a sign of maybe effeminacy, that they were available to men as well. And so you see both things in the culture, and which is one of the reasons why I see almost maybe more the problem itself may have been the men in general in this context, but it seems like he's addressing both, not just the women, for instance. So
exactly, yeah. The problem, if it's a cultural issue, it could have been what men were choosing to do that culturally they should not do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. But either way, it does. They're both doing the same thing, and the restrictions are the same, except kind of flipped, if you would.
Exactly.
I'm looking through the chat room real quick before we get to that. We understand it contextually at this time period when Paul's writing this. It was a shame for a woman to be shaved, so therefore, if she prayed or prophesied with her head uncovered, then it would be the same as if she were shaved. If it's a shame to be shorn or shaved, then let her, of course, be covered in the instance of praying or prophesying. Verse 7, for man indeed ought not to cover his head. It's the same covering, whichever we're talking about, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Hence, in praying or prophesying, that's why she has to have her head covered, contextually, based on what Paul's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's look to the chat room here for a moment. There's been some discussion in here, and let me bring this up real quick. I'm going through this. Eugene Tidwell asked the question regarding 1 Corinthians 14:14. Is it talking speaking in tongues? He says it is talking about speaking in tongues, not praying. And there's some discussion there about the scripture saying praying in tongues. And so they talk a little bit about was it a prayer from God or a prayer from his own heart. And I've often wondered that myself. I've often thought someone's praying in tongues, that it is their prayer that they're praying, but is being manifested in the speaking of tongues, and therefore would need an interpreter. The person would understand what they're praying, but the congregation would not. I could be off on that. I need to look at the text again. Brian points out regarding Old Testament passages about women being shaved, if she took the Nazirite vow, she would have to shave her head at the close of the Nazirite vow. Carl says in verse 15 of 1 Corinthians 14, suggests spirit and mind. That's where the prayer is coming from. And then Randall puts 1 Corinthians 14:14 in the chat room. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. Randall then says we aren't talking about individual decisions on humbleness. We're talking about the context of this verse, and that's fundamentally right, what we're looking at. Seth does point out that the context is talking about keeping your place and not usurping authority. If you find a way to help you do that, by all means. My thoughts is, though, was the women choosing not to wear the covering a usurping of authority, or was it viewed as a usurping of authority? And it may be the same question, but we'll talk about it here in a minute. Seth says usurping authority is certainly tied to pride, not being humble. Eugene says that the Geneva Bible in verse 5 uses the word bareheaded, not uncovered. Interesting point, as in that would be a shaved head. Any thoughts or comments about any of the thoughts or comments seen within the chat room?
I'll comment on the bareheadedness. Again, the uncovered is the opposite of the covered there. So we're looking at the covering, which I've got 6 lexicons in my bookshelf right there. They all say it means a veil. Every single one of them, without a doubt, no question. Right. So if we're talking about a veil there, then the uncovered is not wearing a veil based on this context. Right. So.
Now, a little bit later, we're going to step into a verse that will suggest that something else is given to her for a covering, but the Greek word there is going to be different in that text, if I remember correctly. So we'll look at that here in just a moment. Anyone else has any thoughts? Do y'all have any thoughts on the chat room or for the chat room? All right, notice there in verse 8, he says, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. All right, now this is a very simple concept and principle. It goes back to God over Christ, Christ over man. God made woman for the man, going back to the very beginning of all things. So for this reason, verse 10 says, let me jump over there to Seth's window. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. As if Paul was not making this difficult enough, he then throws in one more phrase, because of the angels. So let's talk about this for a moment and see if we've got any brilliance here amongst us, because I don't.
If I might say something about verse 8 and verse 9.
Yes, go ahead, Seth.
I've heard that said, oh, well, here, let me show my face if that's what you really want to see. Verse 8 and verse 9 alludes to creation language, that creation has taught us always that women, that this what Paul is teaching us is true, and that creation teaches us somehow that women should be covered, that men should be uncovered. I don't see anywhere in the Old Testament that teaches that principle, no. that if creation taught us this, then it should have been understood from creation. But Paul's teaching us here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and without it we wouldn't know anything about it, that what verse 8 and verse 9 is teaching us isn't about the head covering and whether or not you should cover your head or not cover your head. It's teaching us about the authority hierarchy, and that's what we're trying to really learn from the chapter, not whether or not we should have something on top of our head or not. That's the point of the whole chapter.
And even in verse 14, when it talks about does not nature itself teach, it really, when you're looking at that, he's talking about the customs of the day, because we even see men and women in different cultures where maybe men have longer hair than women. Maybe women have shorter hair, and that's genetically just how they function. So it's not a true principle in all creation that men grow hair slower than women. That's not a genetic truth. And so we see that in different cultures, in different contexts. And in Paul's day, the custom was men had short hair, women had long hair, and that's what the nature would be in that passage. So.
And even then, that's kind of a relative question too. I mean, we might look at men of that time and their length of their hair and determine they had long hair compared to us.
Right.
I mean, there's again, it's kind of like how short is short regarding a pair
Exactly.
of shorts. I mean, where's the defining line on where and women, and I'm getting off topic here really quick, but I know women who lose their hair later in life and they have to wear wigs. I mean, and I mean that doesn't have anything to do with anything. I just thought it was interesting. Talking about the natural use of it. We'll look at
Well,
that.
and I think that's a problem that some who teach that this covering is, or they take hair rules from this passage, is how long is long and how short is short, and it makes no, certain measurement. It's not measured in cubits or anything like that of what your hair length should be.
Well, shoulder. All Paul would have to say is that if a man prays or prophesy with his hair touching his shoulders, I mean, it would have been easy to have given some sort of physical limitations on it, but he didn't. Yeah. But as Seth pointed out, 8 and 9 points directly to verse 10. All right, going back to the creation, this is the reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. Now, let me reread that. The New King James Version adds symbol of and her. So it would read, for this reason the woman ought to have authority on head because of the angels. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, I've heard two suggestions that sound somewhat plausible. In the end, we really don't know. If you've got it on my screen, Isaiah 6 verse 2, talking about the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. 2 he covered his face. 2 he covered his feet. With 2 he flew. Here, the seraphim are literally covering their heads out of respect for their head, out of respect for the Lord. A second alternative, one that I think it might be a little bit better, we see in Jude chapter 1 verse 6, talking about the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling, and they take instead of staying within their own authority and what great authority they would have, they usurp the authority and shame their head, just like we have in this passage. Whether either of these passages really have anything to do with 1 Corinthians 11, I'm not sure, but these are two that I've heard that we could go and see something along these lines, something that might give us an indication of what it is that Paul's talking about.
As in relation to having authority on her head because of the angels.
Yes, that women should have their head covered to help them to show their position of authority. Angels got out of their position of authority, usurped their authority, abused the authority that God had given them, and they tried to take the place of God in certain ways.
I've heard it suggested, and I think it's a very good point. I've heard it suggested that that the primary application of this would be, in that time period, this symbol of authority was the head covering. And today, or whatever culture you live in, if there's a symbol of authority that identifies the woman in subjection to the man, then the woman must wear that, whatever it may be. Now, I don't know, how far I would take that, but I've heard some say the wedding ring is that symbol of authority. See, my wife has authority over me. I'm wearing the ring. No, but culturally is where they kind of anchor as determining what this symbol of authority actually is. I don't know.
And also too, just to show Paul's play on words here with the word head, nobody reads this. For this reason, a woman ought to have a sign of authority on her husband. Nobody reads that as head, the person over her. So just understand that he's using this word as a double play in this passage. So not always is it referring to Christ, not always is it referring to the man, not always is it referring to their specific head. Sometimes it is referring to the literal head in this passage. But I think he does use double meanings in this passage because this is a word that contextually can use those. I'll say this before I speak. Because of the angels, I honestly don't think there's enough information for us to decide on something. But I do agree with Seth that in my opinion, the best answer I've heard is that possibly since spiritual or angels are spiritually in fellowship with us, observe our worship to some extent, that they would even be shocked and ashamed to see women not respecting authority or men not respecting authority because they themselves submit to authority. And maybe that's the consideration, because when you get to chapter 11, a lot of that is about consideration of others. And so you're not choosing to do things out of consideration for others, and this possibly may be a women, you should wear the sign of authority because this is out of consideration for the angels and them as well. Now, whether or not that has any weight, I have no idea, but that was the best explanation that I've heard personally. But I won't be dogmatic about it at all.
I've heard some explanations that are significantly farther out there.
Yeah, I didn't want to touch on those.
All right, let's see. We've got some comments in the chat room before we bring them in. Let's bring in 11 and 12 real quick, lest anyone think that women are inherently inferior to men. He makes the point that neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through the woman. But all things are God. You know, and Seth, you had that up there for me. So that the point is, or it seems to be the point that he's making, well, having all said this, keep in mind that men and women are equal. All right, men wouldn't be here today if it weren't for women. You know, so something just kind of think about and ponder there for a moment. All right, let's bring the chat room in, and the last we read was Eugene Tidwell's reference to the Geneva Bible. And so let's start with Chance's comments there following that. Tom, would you want to continue the reading?
Sure, I can do that. Let you get it up here.
All right.
Okay, he goes on and he says, we are viewing divine instruction for those believers then. There would have been two courses of action then, no middle ground. For today, Paul points for future generations in verse 16. So head coverings today is a lack of command and context. I would be considered public display of head covering in worship for extra zeal as dangerously confusing, for less learned to observe and become confused.
All right, that's good thought.
Yeah. Randall just makes the observation, the Geneva Bible is not our standard. It's the original Koine Greek, and that's true with any version. It doesn't matter what version you have. It really seems like our culture of today is what makes this really hard to understand all the implications. Amen. It's so different today.
Because our culture in America doesn't have a clear thing that says women will wear this because of they're in man's over their head, and men will wear this or not wear this because of that.
Right. Well, not only that, our culture won't even respect the principle in the first place, much less the symbol.
That's true.
So anyways, he goes on, I agree, but what word was used in the Greek?
And Daniel, I think you touched on that a while ago, didn't you?
Yeah, we've been touching on that, so yes.
On the covering, yes.
Right.
Okay.
Or is he talking about the word for prayer in there?
I think the word bareheaded.
Yeah, or uncovered, which you mentioned.
Okay.
Well, you know, back up here he references the Geneva Bible where it says in verse 5 uses the word bareheaded, not uncovered. And so he's talking about the Greek word of translated as uncovered there.
I had to reload because it's not loading messages for me, so I had to reload, and that was the last one I had. So.
Okay. All right. Sorry. All right. Go ahead, Tom. Let's continue. We've got a few more, and then we'll pull the study to a close.
Okay. So Carl or Chance points out some conversation with Carl. My point matured. by misunderstanding. I'm assuming that's over time.
Okay.
So it sounds, Carl says, so it sounds like the crux of all of this is the fact that women show a submissive state during services, and show this by the head covering, and he has it down. This is a question, and I think one of the points that we've made is, I don't believe this is dealing with the worship services, because again, when we get to chapter 14, there's some problems with that.
Well, we had some differing.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. Women are also commanded to sing as well.
Right.
They can cough and sneeze and make other noises. What is exactly taught in that other chapter? I think again it's talking about usurping authority rather than not making a noise.
Right. Oh yeah. And I understand that there exactly. But the point is here is it's the praying and prophesying.
Well, and again, as Tom's pointed out, the praying and the prophesying is the leading part. They're not leading in a mixed assembly. So this would inevitably be in any congregation that has a man always outside the assembly, and that would be the application when you factor in 1 Corinthians 14.
Right.
And limited to the praying and prophesying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's what he's dealing with. If anyone prays or prophesy under this condition, then here's the result.
There's something, and I pointed this out last week, but there's something about the miraculous here with prophesying that's different from teaching. There's something different, and maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't understand it is because we don't have the spiritual gifts today. We don't know the difference personally, and there seems to be a difference between just regular prayers and these praying in the Spirit that required these applications as well. And so I don't know what that is, but there's a reason Paul chose prophecy instead of teaching in general.
Okay. I'm still not 100% sure about the limitation or not limiting this to worship service, but that's another discussion. And we talked about it last week, so the different viewpoints on it. So in answer to Carl's question there, it would be showing the submission while she's praying or prophesying. That's whether it's in or out of worship, depending on how you take it. It would be that context there. The woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered is what he's talking about here, or in the man doing it with his head covered. Go ahead, Tom. We need to we'll kind of get ahead of our chat room.
Randall says that's what we glean from this whole chapter is that God put an order of things, and we need to respect that order, and we need to keep that place whether we are a man or a woman. Amen. And that summarizes.
But to mind, though, just what we read a while ago, in reality, we're both equal in the sight of God.
Right.
We just have different roles, and Paul makes that point.
Right.
Right.
And I think that's the point Randall's making there, too.
Yep,
we respect our role.
Exactly. I agree.
Wherever God has placed us. And he goes, I agree with the Jude 6 passage, not contentious. Carl's asking about the wedding ring that you discussed as an example. Randall...
I've heard some people put that forth that the wedding ring is, but if you say the wedding ring is the modern day example of that, then you would have to say then that context this is talking about a married woman and a married man.
He has a better suggestion later on.
Oh, okay, all right.
Right. Okay. Verse 4, excuse me, Randall. I say this because the whole chapter is on authority, not on the head covering. This is just a small part of the whole chapter.
That's true.
And of course we'll see that. Not only in chapter 11, but keep going forward.
Right.
So.
All right. Let's go a little faster, Tom.
Okay. I agree with. I'm sorry. I agree with Randall. This is all about submission. All submit, but we do so with a different application. Carl agrees. Rather than the wedding band, I see the taking of the last name as a modern measure of submission.
Brian Haynes.
Haynes. And then Carl Ford, so that seems to be to point back to the ESV translation using wives, if that is what we arrive at.
Okay, so he'd already said that, okay.
Yes, and then Chance, Carl, yes, applying then confused in the infancy of the church by teaching such as Galatians 3:28, a teaching available then. But it was not the context in Galatians to apply here in Corinth. Order still stands. A man was created first. His authority is above woman in the construction during worship.
Okay, applying it here in the worship service.
Exactly.
All right.
And then there's agreement. Carl, yes, I should have used a different word in place of services.
Okay.
I didn't mean to limit it to that, and smiley face.
Okay.
So, Carl, I wonder if the application of Priscilla and Aquila taking Apollos aside could be the fact that the woman was not usurping authority and just thinking. And that was outside of an assembly, as far as we know.
But she wasn't praying or prophesying.
Yes. But she might have assisted in teaching.
Right, but
was
the point
Apollos
is,
even a Christian at that point?
who's that?
And was Apollos even a Christian at that point?
Not by our understanding of it, no. Because he had not yet been baptized the baptism of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was a believer, but not yet properly obedience to the gospel. Yeah.
So you got challenges. Anyways, that's it with the chat room. That's enough.
Okay, yeah, that's all, and we're past time. I tell you what, guys, y'all have helped us do a better job today of really keeping to the context because.
Yes, very, very good.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really appreciate that. The one thing I keep coming back to is keep in mind he begins it by talking the rule of principle, the rule of thumb is praying or prophesying, man or woman, under these conditions yields these results. And I think everything else explains why that is the case. Mm-hmm. But it seems like that's the primary point. But I think authority is the underlying foundation for why a man and woman praying or prophesying under these situations yield these results. Does that make sense?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that's why, when it talks about a sign of authority, again, it seems like more for the part of others rather than yourself in perception. Right. Because if you have to have something that's visibly present to the individuals around you, it seems like it's more for them than it is for you personally. The same with modesty. The reason that, a person wears modest attire, which they should, is not for themselves. They're not lusting after their own self, They're doing that to cover themselves, to prevent lusting of others. It's a consideration of others' question. And so all things that deal with appearance are for the consideration of other people, not necessarily the person themselves.
That's a good point. It's hard to see that directly stated in the chapter, but when you said it seems like, I can understand that. It kind of would appear that's why he's addressing the subject like that. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or comments as we begin to close our study? Let's start with you, Daniel.
I just want to thank everybody for all your comments and questions, and I agree with John. It was obvious that all the comments were kind of right along in thread with the verses we were dealing with, and we appreciate that so very much, and appreciate the thought-provoking questions and comments. And if there's anything that we haven't addressed, we encourage you to just write us and ask us a question maybe that we didn't. But I hope you all have a blessed day. Absolutely.
Seth?
I would like to encourage everyone, if you do not agree with something things have said today, especially me, I know that I misspeak far too much. And if you want to take this link and share it with people and say, look at the false things that Seth said, or any of us, and take it out of context, I can't guarantee that I'll always agree with what I've said today. My encouragement to you, right there at the bottom of my name, is my email address. Send me an email, Skype with me, talk to me in person about how I feel about it, and if we still don't agree, then by all means spread the word to all who will listen to you to save them from whatever error that I might be teaching. I want to be saved, I want you to be saved, and I want other people to be saved. The things that I say, I really want to just speak the truth, and if you can help me find truth, please be my friend and tell me about it. If you don't agree with anything that we've said today, don't just go around and sharing it. Please contact us. And we really appreciate coming together and reasoning together. That's the whole point of us doing this. If you can help us to come to a better understanding of the truth, then by all means, please contact us.
That's right. And let me add to that, Seth, real quick before we go to Tom. It's not our goal to set out to say, here's exactly what Paul means, and we're going to convince you of it.
This is not a
verse
board of
by
directors
verse.
meeting to decide the faith of everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally to go by verse, and if we see something that we're off individually, then we change. So,
Right.
thank you so much, Seth, for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I always enjoy being with you.
Which reminds me, and I haven't talked with our panel yet, but Seth, Paul will be back next week, but why don't you plan to join us one more week, because we're in the context of this, and give you a chance to be a part of the remainder of discussion that we've been looking at.
All righty, sounds good.
Sounds good? All right. All right, Tom, any final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, again, I've enjoyed the study. One thing to say about the chat room, they've helped us keep on track, like you mentioned. I'm not convinced that there's agreement with everyone in the chat room on this, but I will say this. I believe that the discussion has been carried out in a brotherly manner.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you all for that, and I appreciate that in the discussion. We all have things to think about with
Absolutely.
this. And we look forward to concluding this next week. So, John?
Appreciate it, Tom. Appreciate it, Seth and Daniel and everybody in the chat room. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are way over time, so we'll pull it to a quick close. Thank you so much for joining us. Lord willing, we'll see you back here again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
Noon Eastern Time.
9 o'clock Pacific Time.
And 6 a.m. Hawaii time.
I'm delaying on the transfer, so back to me right here at live.truthfactor.com. Y'all have a very wonderful week.